So welcome to this discussion. What are we talking about today? Do you remember?
Something to do with guns.
Something to do with guns.
Yeah.
My name is Jeff Goldberg. I'm from the Atlantic, and I have with me Dan Gross, the head of the Brady campaign. You all know of their work. I don't have to do an extension. Oh, a little bias, huh? I don't have to do an extensive introduction. One thing I did want to say was, it's funny when Dan and I were talking yesterday about this, plotting different things to talk about. He mentioned that we've had some terrific fights over the phone on this issue. Fights?
Spirited conversations.
Spirited, full and frank exchange of views. And it might have been worthwhile just to record those fights and play them for you, and we can go out and get lunch, and then you could ask questions. But I didn't record them, so here we are.
Here we are.
And so, you know, I want to cover the waterfront on this issue, not just the legislative piece. But let's start there. And before I do that, we're going to talk for a while, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience. And I'm hoping that there are people in this audience who are gun enthusiasts or gun rights advocates or NRA members, and that I would hope that you would participate and raise your hands. If you could signal me telepathically that you're an NRA member, I'll try to call on you first. Or just stand up and scream, "I'm an NRA member," and then you could have the floor for a minute or two. And one of the issues in this issue, one of the problems in this issue, and we've talked about this in the past, is that the opposition to where he stands, the NRA and some like-minded groups, they don't like to debate this issue, and I want to talk about that in a minute because it's a very interesting and troubling aspect of this argument in America. But let's start on the legislative front and go to the obvious question, which I think you, as the head of the premier organization advocating for gun legislation, for different aspects of gun control, why has your side failed time and time again when polls show, in particular, on the subject of background checks, universalizing background checks, that, I mean, it's an amazing number, above 90%. More than 90% of Americans say background checks are fine. What's going wrong from the organizational perspective or from the movement perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes down, I guess you can say, to two words: intensity and mythology. You know, there is an intensity gap between those who support sensible gun laws, the 90% of Americans who support background checks, and the very, very small minority of Americans who don't. And that intensity gap has led to the mythology that the gun lobby, and I just want to be clear what we're talking about when we're talking about the NRA here. We're talking about the leadership of the NRA as the corporate gun lobby. Because if you look at the polls among NRA members, 74% of NRA members supported the background check law that was defeated. So I share your invitation, and hopefully, you know, we can have that conversation with folks in the audience who are NRA members as well. But there's this mythology that's been allowed to, you know, that's perpetuated itself in DC, that, you know, you are going to be held accountable if you do what, in essence, is the right thing on behalf of your
Is it mythology, or if you're a senator from North Dakota or South Dakota or even Vermont, a place like that, you can really suffer at the hands of the voters?
Yeah, interestingly, all of the evidence, including, you know, the stuff that's come out recently after the 2012 elections, show that strikingly is not the case. Less than 1% of the money that the gun lobby spent on candidates that they support actually, or against candidates that they wanted to defeat, was spent effectively for the results that they wanted.
Okay, so you're basically arguing that the NRA is, in truth, ineffective and represents virtually no one. So what's going on?
No, well, so,
I'm missing the.
So there are a lot of NRA members. They do misrepresent what the overwhelming majority of their members support from a policy perspective. Now, there are a lot of great things that people take away from the NRA. You know, we have nothing against safety training. In fact, I think there should be more safety training. But from a policy perspective, it's not that they don't represent no one, but they certainly don't represent the 4 million people that they claim to represent.
Let me step back. I'm going to press you on this again because it is one of the mysteries, and it might have more to do with the legislative process and the architecture of our national legislature than anything else. But I want to press you on that. But let's step back for a minute and talk about your organization and you personally, where you stand on Second Amendment issues. Just lay it out for the audience. I know a little bit about where you are, but lay out for your audience where you stand on the right to bear arms.
We completely support it. We completely support the Constitution. I actually looked at a lot of people inside our quote-unquote movement looked at the recent Supreme Court ruling, the Heller versus DC decision, as a huge defeat. I actually looked at it as liberating, because it acknowledges that there is a limited right to bear arms, but at the same time acknowledges, including in the majority ruling by Scalia, that there are things that we can do to regulate that right in the interest of all of our safety, and that's the conversation that we need to be having.
This is what I don't, and I'm asking you now as almost an anthropologist of the NRA as opposed to an opponent of the NRA. If Justice Scalia believes that the Second Amendment allows for regulation of guns. In other words, there are classes of people who the Constitution would not allow to have guns.
Right.
The dangerously mentally ill, convicted criminals, and so on. If Justice Scalia is there, why is the NRA where it is? I mean, we don't generally associate Justice Scalia with extravagant liberalism.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, right. And
so what's the anthropology? What's the explanation?
I mean, Justice Scalia is, speaking on behalf of public safety and on behalf of the, will of the American public, that the NRA, it's in their DNA, in the leadership of the NRA, to oppose. And they do it in the name of the Second Amendment. But when you really examine something like universal background checks that they'll oppose in the name of the Second Amendment, it actually has nothing to do with the Second Amendment. In fact, we argue that background checks strengthen the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens to define those that we all agree shouldn't have them. And that's why 90% of the American public supports that measure. The gun lobby doesn't support it because they're a corporate lobby for the gun industry, and they have been able to get away to this point with misrepresenting the best will, and
is it simply you're arguing that it's simply about selling more guns?
Absolutely.
There's no ideology to this.
I mean, they use ideology to perpetuate and to express their point of view. And then, as soon as you scratch beneath the surface, they misuse that ideology. We talked for a second about the Second Amendment. You tell me how the Second Amendment ties with the background checks that they adamantly oppose.
Right. Well, let me play the role of Wayne LaPierre for a second, which I've been practicing in front of my mirror all morning. And I wish you were here, and I wish David King, I wish all these guys were here. I really do. But in their absence, let me try to rehearse this, and not even playing Wayne LaPierre so much as, I mean, we've talked about this before, and you know that I spent a lot of time with gun owners and gun rights, really stringent gun rights advocates in places where guns are the norm, not the exception. But I've also spent a lot of time with people on your side, people who are less moderate on Second Amendment issues. And so the NRA people I know would say, you know why I oppose gun background checks? Because it's just the first step. It's the foot in the door. And I know that they're going to come for my guns. I know that they're going to try to register my guns, and that is anathema to me because I have my gun to protect myself from tyranny. I don't want the government to know I have a gun. And the truth of the matter is, and you might argue with me on this, but the truth of the matter is there are many people on your side who see Newtown, see Aurora as, to borrow from Rahm Emanuel, don't let a crisis go to waste, who see those issues as opening the door for more and more stringent gun legislation, not just universalizing background checks. Do these NRA people and these pro-gun rights people, are they just paranoid, or are they reacting to something real in your movement, which is a desire to eradicate gun ownership? Well,
I mean, there's no reasonable evidence whatsoever that anything that you just said is true. They use
that was not that was an attack on Wayne
that was
LaPierre.
you as Wayne LaPierre.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah,
I just want to clarify that's just Jeffrey Goldberg starring as Wayne LaPierre.
That's how effective your impression just was. It's the rhetoric that they use to rile up that very, very small number of extremists out there to perpetuate that mythology that there are all those people out there that are as intense about the issue as that small group of extremists.
Do you believe in a national gun registry?
Of course not. And it was written directly into this legislation and said explicitly that this is not going to lead to a national gun registry, that Congress is against the national gun registry. And then, when Senator Cruz was pressed on it in the debate leading up to the vote that tragic day, and that was a tragic day for our country, he said, they asked him what reasonable evidence he has, and he said, it is my impression, let me see if I can do my Senator Cruz impression, that it puts us on the path to a push to a national gun registry.
A path to a push,
and it's his
as
impression.
opposed to a push to a path.
And it's his. I mean, at the second I saw that, I was like, this is going to be on the Daily Show tonight. Sure enough.
Yeah.
But this is the rhetoric out there that's allowed to kind of go on because of that mythology and how effective. And the one thing that the gun lobby is very good at is leveraging that rhetoric and leveraging those visceral insights. They are for something. Our movement needs to do a much better job, and it's part of the change that I'm implementing at the Brady campaign in terms of being for something, being for our collective desire to make this a safer nation, to demonstrate that as a nation we are better than this. But the gun lobby right now has owned the high ground in that regard, and that's been, that's why the intensity and as a result the mythology has been able to go on.
You're not going to achieve I want to come back to the anthropology of gun ownership in a second, because we've both done fairly deep dives on this subject. But I want to come back to that argument. You're not going to win very much at all unless you can convince large numbers of conservative white males in red states that you're not opposed to their gun ownership, that you're just talking about sensible legislation. Why? What?
Do I have to take that at face value?
You don't take anything at face value.
Because I don't necessarily...
Okay, that one you have to take at face value.
All right, because I don't necessarily, just for the record,
you mean the proposition that you're going
to
need red states to push this through?
You're going to need red states, but it's, how you slice and dice the demographics. I mean, we could have a long conversation about.
Then go to the anthropology of this again. I want to understand, and this is the thing about, and one of the reasons I admire your work is that you don't demonize the other side, the gun owner, whatever stereotype you have in your mind of the gun owner, you're not doing the demonization. But why are they scared? They are frightened of the government. They are frightened that the government is going to take away their guns, and the gun stands for independence. What is I want to try to get at the deepest dynamic of what's going on here, because you're right. Once they get motivated, once they get energized, the intensity of their belief is enormous, and your side simply does not match that intensity.
Right. When we are going to win, when the American public looks at this issue, not from the perspective of being a gun owner or a non-gun owner or a Democrat or a Republican or a blue stater or a red stater, but as a decent human beings who are concerned with our collective health and safety as a nation. When we, say enough is enough to sending our children to school scared, to too many people going to bed at night hearing gunshots when they go to sleep out the window. And that's the onus that I've accepted when I became president of this organization, to demonstrate to the American public that this is fundamentally an American issue. And that's when we're going to win. The reality is there aren't a lot of people out there who buy into that kind of paranoia. There's just misunderstanding. There's misunderstanding that I feel that if we can communicate adequately, we can clear up. And by the way, it's already starting to be cleared up. A lot of people looked, obviously, as what happened with this recent Senate vote as a huge defeat, especially a lot of the people that have been out there saying, what kind of tragedy is it going to take to finally call the attention of the American public to this issue, get the American public to wake up, get our Congress people to wake up. I contend that tragedy actually took place the day of the vote. That on the day of the vote, the American public saw in broad daylight the extent to which our collective will and safety is being undermined by their opposition to something that we all support. So it's not as much about changing hearts and minds as it is changing the intensity of those that already agree with us.
Let me go, and this is I've heard from the responsible gun owners over and over again, that one of the problems with the legislation is that it's a non sequitur. The legislation that came out of the Newtown massacre is about universalizing background checks. That's the main item. The assault weapons we'll put to the side for a second. But that legislation would not have stopped the massacre in that elementary school. Adam Lanza's mother owned these weapons legally. She stored them in her house. Her son killed her, took the weapons, shot the people. Yeah. So one of the problems in convincing people that this legislation should be passed is convincing them that it would be useful, or that it's a reaction. It's trying to fix the problem that we saw in Connecticut.
That's been a challenge that's existed on this issue for decades. Is everybody, nobody has kind of the short-term memory to, remember how that kind of arc plays out. We all feel like, this tragedy is it, and it's so utterly heartbreaking that we have to do something about it. But that inevitably fades with the headlines. Sympathy runs incredibly deep. But it's narrow, in order to succeed, we have to demonstrate that this issue is much more than about the sympathy that we have and that we genuinely feel toward victims of gun violence. And I say that personally, by the way, I should point out, for those who don't know, as a victim of gun violence. And that's been, my brother was shot in a shooting that happened on top of the Empire State Building in 1997. It was a tragedy that made front page headlines. And from the very beginning, I remember feeling uncomfortable about the inequity of compassion that existed around what happened to my family versus the 30,000 gun deaths that occur every year in our country. And we have to reframe this issue as, yes, Newtown was a catalyst, but it can't be, it's as it relates to kind of the desire to create change and the activity around it, it's a sugar high. It's not, we need to build this movement around a much more basic desire to make this a safer country.
But you're not answering my question, and my question is, why is the legislation that you got behind a non sequitur of legislation?
Right.
I mean, why don't you
attack
the problem that we saw in Connecticut?
Because that isn't the basic problem that we face in America. It goes back to, I guess I kind of answered your question indirectly. Newtown does not exemplify the most significant, if our goal here is to make this the safest nation it can possibly be, to prevent the most possible gun deaths, we don't, those tragedies get attention because they're anomalies. So we've taken a very careful look at this issue, and we look at it purely from the perspective of how we can save the most lives. Otherwise, it's part of that sugar high. If the numbers aren't there to bear it out, if the genuine opportunity isn't there to bear it out, how can you expect to keep the American public engaged?
Maybe I'm not making myself clear because you're used to having me come at you from the right, but what I'm doing right now is coming at you from the left and saying, one of the problems is that this guy had access to an armory that his mother had built, right? And most Americans would probably say, I don't know if a lady in Connecticut needs to have however many semi-automatic rifles in her house with large clips. And so what I'm getting at is, why don't you, in reaction to Newtown, push for something stronger?
I feel like I'm answering your question. You just don't want to accept it. I feel
that
like
I don't want to accept it. You don't want to accept it. I'm not accepting it.
Right. These are the spirited conversations that we have on the phone.
This ain't nothing yet. This ain't nothing. Wait till he calls me an ignorant slut.
I might be able to vouch for half of that.
It's true. I'm a terrible slut.
That's not background checks is big. That's been an incredible irony to the conversation that came out of Newtown, that the idea of background checks, the idea of making it impossible or less likely that 40% of all gun sales in our country go without the simple questions to verify a background. We can demonstrate the huge impact from a policy perspective that would have on preventing gun violence and saving lives. And what you're talking about with Mrs. Lanza, I also think there's a big opportunity to address that, but we actually think that there's another, and this is where there's a huge opportunity. I don't necessarily think it's a policy conversation, though, regarding the 300 million guns that are out there. And I've kind of been avoiding to go there because I know you want to go there in this conversation, but that's how I suggest we deal with that part of it. From a policy perspective, I contend unequivocally that the most constructive thing that we can do is keep guns out of the hands of the people that we all agree shouldn't have them, including law-abiding gun owners believing that, criminals, convicted felons, domestic abusers, and we can quantifiably show how that will prevent gun violence.
Look, I mean, and let's go to the 300 million, because that's where I think we have a difference. I mean, I've written it, and you know that I agree with you on background, universalizing the background check as a start. And unlike you, I'm for having an open debate about the Second Amendment. I know you aren't, and we should hear from you why you think. I mean, we got an answer on the Heller thing, I think, a few minutes ago. But I would like to see a broader conversation about the nature of our society and the nature and the role guns play in society. I know for reasons of tactics, you don't want to go there.
Well, we do from the public health and safety, public information campaign perspective. Absolutely, we should go there. And the whole idea there is to inspire an honest conversation that acknowledges the potential benefits of people who own guns responsibly. I catch a lot of flack from our own supporters when I say this. You are not a bad person if you are a father who wants to bring a gun into your home to protect your family. You may be a misinformed person if you leave that gun accessible to somebody who can do damage. And that's the conversation that we need to have as a nation, because that's something that's almost the only thing that could have conceivably prevented Newtown, in my opinion. Hey, Mrs. Lanza, it might not be the best idea to have an armory in your house if you have a child that you've identified as having some potential issues.
Let's go to the 300 million guns, 300 million plus, because we know that in these long moments when we're talking about gun control, gun sales spike. I mean, Smith & Wesson's stock is up 50% this year because of Newtown. I mean, that's just the nature of the market. So let's go to this. And while I don't disagree with you that gun background checks at gun shows and private sales would be a useful tool, my argument has always been that it's too late. That when you have a country in which there's 300 million plus personal arms, that we're closing the barn door way after the horse has gone out. Yeah. And so that's why I'm arguing for the ineffectivity of it.
And you ended your article in The Atlantic about quoting me and saying that is kind of the last word. So now I kind of get another one on that.
Then I'm going to get the last word.
We'll see. Yeah, I mean, it's two different things. Why, if there are things that we can do every day, 40% of all gun sales go without a background check. Every day, more and more guns are not only coming onto the market, but coming onto the market in the hands of people who we all agree shouldn't have them. Why, just because we do need to do something to address the 300 million guns out there, is it too late to do something from a policy perspective? There's a lot of good. There's no black market for guns. It's not like drugs, where drugs are smuggled into this country and automatically start out illegal. Every gun that's purchased in our country starts out at a federally licensed firearm dealer. We know the very clear paths that those guns take to get into the hands of criminals and domestic abusers. So why not have a conversation about what we can do?
That the average handgun produced by by competent handgun manufacturers can last 100 or 150 years, even if it's not taken care of well.
Right. So, but you're stemming. I mean, I might suggest we have the conversation about the 300 million if we want to find middle ground here, without writing off the conversation about background checks. No.
But what I'm saying is the background check.
It's too late.
Given the reality of the 300 million guns, given the reality that a gun, even improperly maintained, can last 100 or 150 years, that this conversation is actually a completely inadequate conversation if you want to talk about effective gun
but that's
control.
different than it's too late. It's that we have to have a bigger conversation. So that's kind of the little.
I'm trying to push you toward that bigger conversation.
Yeah, no, let's have it, but let's not have it in the spirit of now. But it's not in the spirit of it's too late to talk about to do anything in terms of background checks.
Look, I understand from a legislative perspective, you want to move the ball incrementally. It's fine, but I'm not sure how. I mean,
all right, we're definitely going to need to agree to disagree on that on the legislative
give us
part.
the numbers. Give us the numbers then. If you number of people refused when they go through a background check, because those numbers are real.
Right,
and
those numbers are real. I'll give you, we just threw a FOIA request, just as an example, found out in Virginia where they only do background checks at gun shows. They don't do background checks on the internet, on internet sales, or that I think it was 1,200 in the last like 7 or 8 years, 1,200 fugitives. I mean, these are the world's dumbest fugitives because they could have just gone on the internet and bought a gun without any problem. Have been
thank God for dumb fugitives.
Right, exactly. Have been apprehended because of background checks. I mean, that's an example. And part of it, you do have to speculate. You have to say if there are 40% of gun sales that happen in our country every day in which criminals can buy guns without background checks. Criminals are like water. They're going to find the path of least resistance. It's also why passing these things on a state level only do so much good. They do good, and they're linked to, like this case in Virginia, apprehending fugitives and a lot of, decline. The Brady Law, since the Brady Law went into effect in 1994, which is the original background check law that only applies to federally licensed firearm dealers, 2 million prohibited purchasers have been prevented from buying guns through federally licensed firearm dealers.
Why do criminals not have a hard time finding guns?
Because they can go to a gun show or go on the internet and buy guns.
But is that how they really do it, or are they buying
That's how a lot of them do. And then this is the other argument that I don't accept. Just because there are other ways, they can steal them. That handgun that lasts in somebody, and the estimates 200,000 to 500,000 guns every year are stolen. There are, community guns is a big problem that's emerging in terms of gang violence and inner city violence, where a straw purchaser will buy a gun and keep it in a house or a hiding place in a community, and that gun will be used in crimes. But again, I want to go to this point. There is no kind of black market that just starts out. These guns are originally purchased legally from a federally licensed firearm dealer, very often either by the person who is intent on doing the damage or a person who goes there with the intent of then reselling it to the person who does that damage. These are very direct, clear links that exist and that we can do a lot about through criminal background checks.
Let's go to a slightly different subject. On Monday, I think it's Monday, I'm going to be moderating a debate between Asa Hutchinson, who is the sort of only person in that universe who does come out and talk about this thing. Asa Hutchinson is the former head of the DA, former congressman, who's in charge of I suppose it's the NRA's school safety program, the thing that they announced after Newtown. And he's going to be talking or debating Randy Weingarten, the head of the American Federation of Teachers. And I'm going to be moderating this on Monday, and I'm looking forward to it the way I look forward to a colonoscopy, but it'll be, we'll get through it. But this is an issue where we actually really do disagree, I think, to some degree. And that's on concealed carry and the role that civilians who are licensed and trained to carry firearms can play in public safety, given that our country is already saturated with arms and bad people have arms. And, and I told you about this when we first started talking about this, that I had the Long Island Railroad Massacre, which was a long time, that's like 20 massacres ago, I guess, already, right? But in the mid-90s, there was a guy who came onto the Long Island Railroad train that I used to ride all the time, that's why it struck me, and shot, I think, 7 people to death, wounded a bunch of others, and they were sitting ducks. And I remember very vividly, and this is where
Carolyn McCarthy's husband.
Carolyn McCarthy's husband was one of the people who was killed. Her son was grievously injured,
yep.
Right, yeah, and she ran for Congress and won the seat, actually, of that district. And I remember having what for, I guess, a liberal Aspen audience is a heterodoxical thought, which is, if I had been on that train, I would rather have been armed than unarmed, because those people were sitting ducks. And we see the sitting duck syndrome again and again at Virginia Tech. People are blocking doors, or Aurora, they have no recourse whatsoever. And so I asked you, and we could rehearse this again, I asked you, if you were in that situation, a situation in which, God forbid, somebody walks into a room and just starts shooting people to death, would you rather have a gun or not have a gun? And take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I honestly don't think I know the answer to that, because it is, you know, so much of what I've seen demonstrates, and, you know, a preponderance of the evidence as well, that, you know, the more guns you introduce into a situation, the more likely it becomes that innocent civilians, more lives will be taken. A great example of that is the more recent shooting at the Empire State Building, where a man, I've gotten to know his family very well recently, we share a bizarre bond, was killed, and then the assailant was trying to escape and wound up having a shootout with trained law enforcement officers. 9 people were shot in that shootout. Only one of them was the assailant.
But he wasn't trying to escape. He was approaching those police officers with the intent to shoot them. They had no recourse but to fire back.
Okay, whatever it is.
Well, no, there's a big difference than running away.
He was in the process of running. He was in the process of running away. I mean, there was a.
I saw the video. He was running at them.
Well, he was running away from the scene, and they were chasing.
And you're arguing that it's worse that the police officer shot him, or worse?
No, what I'm arguing, what I'm demonstrating is that these are the most highly trained people, you know, that you can find as it relates to the use of firearms. They go through active training, and, you know, I don't know if you've seen any of the studies. I know you shoot yourself, as I have. You know,
I don't shoot myself.
No, you shoot.
I shoot myself.
Right. There you go. Maybe there's a comma in there or something like that.
He shoots and leaves.
Right. You yourself shoot.
Yes.
I myself have.
It's hard to shoot yourself repeatedly. Actually.
Right.
Yeah. No, I understand. Go on.
I myself have shot, and you know, and you know, they've done all these studies that show, you know, they'll have people sitting in a classroom, and, you know, sometimes it's even a gun safety scenario, and, you know, an assailant will walk in, and you'll then see that, you know, people, their blood pressure, all the physiological things go nuts, and you know, there's just a lot of evidence that shows that at the very least there's a good conversation to have around how much more dangerous it makes a situation to introduce more guns. Now, that said,
why are you at all ambivalent about
I
the
will
question?
say that I am, because I am not necessarily opposed to the idea of a highly trained, law-abiding person carrying a gun. What I am opposed to, and this is a question, I guess, that I would put back to you, you know, do you think George Zimmerman, in the news right now, a man with an arrest record and a history of violence, should have been able to legally carry a loaded hidden gun on the street the night that he shot Trayvon Martin?
I don't think the guy should be allowed to carry a Mars bar, but that's that. You know, but you can say. But here's the thing. What you're doing is.
I think the more constructive conversation. Let me just finish the point. I think the more constructive conversation is regarding, you know, is where we all agree in terms of what the reasonable standard should be in terms of who should be able to carry a gun.
You know as well as I do that there are more than 10 million Americans now with concealed carry permits, not law enforcement officers, but civilian Americans with concealed carry permits, and you know the numbers. They commit crimes at a lower rate than the general population. I mean, you know, and so yes, you could hold out George Zimmerman, obviously, and obviously you don't want George Zimmerman to have guns, and obviously also Florida's concealed carry laws are kind of a joke. I mean, we know that, but if you can't dismiss the 10 million plus people who carry responsibly, who don't go around shooting people in their neighborhoods for no reason, and who do commit.
And you don't hear me.
The interesting statistic is they commit crimes at a lower rate than police officers commit crimes.
Yeah, you know, there really aren't good studies on that, and there are other studies that show that that, you know, use of guns in self-defense are significant, and then there are other studies that show that they're far outweighed, especially when it comes to homicide.
Look, I think we both agree that the CDC should do a lot more work.
By murder. I actually think we're both saying that somewhere in there we could see a reasonable conversation on where that line should occur. I want to demonstrate every step of the way that we respect the fact that people can lawfully, legally, and responsibly own guns. We are not trying to take anybody's guns away from them. What we are trying to do is come together where we all agree in terms of protecting public safety. So I think a much more constructive conversation is around places like Florida, where this, South Florida Sun Sentinel did a study that showed 1,500 convicted felons were walking around with concealed carry permits because of their lax laws. And laws, by the way, that the NRA leadership looked at as their model for what that, combined with Stand Your Ground, that they want to spread to every state. So I think, we can have a philosophical conversation. And I honestly don't know how I feel about whether I would personally feel safer in a situation, which, by the way, is not the normal situation. Very few people are in. One person who was in that situation was my brother.
Right.
And a lot of people that I know that were up on top of the Empire State Building that day, the way they described the chaos. I've since worked with a lot of victims, from the movie theater shooting in Aurora to Virginia Tech, almost to a person. They say with certainty, it's all anecdotal, but I think it's anecdotal evidence we should take with a lot of gravity, that introducing more guns into that situation would have made it more dangerous. There was a gun owner who was on the spot, from what I understand, in Tucson, and where Gabby Giffords was shot. That chose not, and thanks their lucky stars they didn't, because they said they were about to shoot the wrong person.
There are also stories, the Utah Mall story.
Of course,
they're counter evidence.
So, but that, we can have that conversation. That, to me,
when are we going to do that one?
Not now.
All right.
That one, to me, because that, to me, is a...
We'll be going until 7 p.m. tonight.
That, to me, is a philosophical conversation. But I don't want to have that philosophical conversation at the expense of talking about the things that we can actually do to prevent gun violence, and keeping guns out of the hands of people like George Zimmerman, who are too easily able to get them.
Let me make an observation that I have a feeling the audience, many people in the audience would make, especially those who know the NRA. And I guess this is, I'm praising you and insulting you at the same time. Which is,
that's
whatever.
50% better than what usually happens.
Right? No. When I listen to you, and I've written this, you know this. When I listen to you, you are very moderate and rational, and you cede really an incredible amount of territory to the opposition. We both know the NRA. The NRA doesn't cede anything to you, and we also know something else. We know how, you're in Washington a lot, I live there. We know how Washington works. The compromise in today's hyper-partisan atmosphere and no-holds-barred legislating process, compromise is not rewarded by people saying, you know what, Dan, you're so reasonable, I think I'm going to meet you halfway. I'm wondering if
common sense isn't sexy.
I'm wondering, and I think this, and I think I'm speaking on behalf of people who would like to see your group work harder in more dramatic ways. I'm wondering if you guys are one day going to wake up and say, you know what, we can't beat the NRA absolutism with Brady moderation.
Yeah. See, and if that continues to be what people take away from this organization and this movement, we will have failed. I don't look at anything that we're doing as moderate. I don't look at it as aggressive. I don't look at it as conservative. I don't look at it as progressive. We are a one-issue organization, and we are about preventing people from getting shot. And we look at everything through that lens. And I can say, again, I can tell you very, very firmly how, and we've had this conversation already even now, how criminal background checks can lead to the prevention of gun violence. That, in all honesty, is a harder conversation to have around assault weapons ban. I do believe that that's a very important conversation to have for what kind of nation do we want to live in. A lot of our members believe that that's actually the most important conversation. Yeah, the assault weapons ban. I think if we were out there saying that, you would probably, in your model of moderate versus, whatever the opposite of moderate, aggressive, would say that's then Brady being more aggressive. I don't care about any of that. I just care about what we can do to make this a safer country. And that's why I don't look at background checks as being soft. I look at that as being very aggressive. And also, we are very aggressively going after the other half of the equation, which is engaging the people who own the 300 million guns out there and the people who live in the communities with them in a new national conversation in terms of what we can do to encourage more responsible behavior, social norms, like friends don't let friends drive drunk and secondhand smoke.
I want to clarify something here. Are you saying that you did not push the assault weapons ban?
No, we did.
No, but you didn't. I mean, you didn't push it nearly as hard.
We did. And, you know, that's a big part of Brady's heritage and equity. And, you know, we helped to get the original background assault weapons ban bill passed. But what we also acknowledged every step of the way is that that's a different conversation as it relates to preventing the most possible gun deaths. And that, by the way, is the arc that always happens after one of these high-profile tragedies. The nation gets, you know, for very obvious and appropriate reasons, engaged in this issue momentarily because it typically involves an assault weapon. You know, you have the conversation centers around that. And I think that's part of the reason why it dissipates, because inevitably that alone is not a big enough conversation. And you know, you can much more easily demonstrate how something like criminal background checks, not only is that where a middle ground happens to be, right, which it does happen to be a middle ground, but that's not ceding anything. That's, you know, we can demonstrate how that has the opportunity to save lives and prevent gun violence. And by the way, there's another important part of the assault weapons conversation that we think is very important, which is high capacity magazines. Again, these are conversations that we believe very strongly we have to have, that we were pushing for, but as part of the president and the White House's bigger agenda, and that was the genius of what happened right after Newtown from the perspective of the White House, is that, you know, they immediately started to engage the American public in a bigger conversation, so that this wasn't just about Newtown. Again, Newtown will always, for whatever we wind up passing, and we will wind up succeeding, Newtown will always be looked back as a catalyst, but change will not happen until the American public gets engaged on a far deeper level than around any one tragedy, around our own concerns, around the safety of our own children, around the safety of our own communities.
Let me open it up to questions now. Is there a mic moving around? Why don't we start in the back there, where you're standing? Yeah, right all the way to the back. And by the way, please keep these in the form of a question.
Yeah.
Because we want to get to as many as possible.
Yeah, I'll go quickly. I'm a gun owner and a hunter, and in that sense, I'm around a lot of very deeply read people, both in California and New York. I would say to a person, they are for background checks, for gun registry, even in private sales between friends, and for requalification on a carry permit. Very surprisingly, but everybody is for that. So I feel that the NRA represents our interests really in the way that Westboro Baptist represents the interests of free speech. So how do you make the organization like the NRA as toxic as Westboro Baptist so people want to listen to the people as opposed to this fundraising organization?
Yeah, and that's entirely what we're focused on. Making the NRA toxic is a byproduct of what we're focused on, which is engaging the voice of the American public, which is our sole mission from a policy perspective, which includes the overwhelming majority of gun owners that do support the measures that we're talking about. And then, you know, breaking the mythology that exists. And this recent Senate vote is has really changed the landscape. You know, you looked at the polling numbers for Ayotte in New Hampshire, who was opposed to, who voted no on this legislation, and Toomey in Pennsylvania, who supported this legislation. Ayotte took a precipitous drop in her, unprecedented in terms of her polling numbers, and Toomey, who represents Pennsylvania, which, you know, back to Rick Santorum and others, you know, as you know, you've always had senators who have run and had an A rating from the NRA, including Toomey, running on this issue. Toomey's polling numbers went up. We helped to put 30,000 calls into the offices of Congress from an outraged American public that included people who own guns and people who don't. You know, that's the kind of stuff that we need to do. We need to ratchet up the intensity of the overwhelming majority majority of Americans who support this and make it more intense than the very small minority of extremists who were never going to be able to change their minds.
Right over here. But before I do that, I once again want to make a plea, and I do wish we did invite the NRA obviously to be here, and they're not. But if there's someone in this audience who is a Second Amendment advocate or someone who supports that position, please raise your hand. I will cede the floor. We'd be happy to hear from you. I'll even buy you a Pepsi afterwards.
Can I ask the gentleman who just actually asked the question, do you consider yourself supportive of the Second Amendment?
Yeah, within limits, the way I think free speech is supported, but you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater.
Right. So that's a point I just want to make to you, Jeff, that, I mean, we can kind of search for somebody who, the context of their Second Amendment advocacy means that they disagree with everything that we're saying. But I just also want to demonstrate that the overwhelming majority of people who believe in the Second Amendment, who own guns, who are members of the NRA, don't disagree. So I don't want to,
I understand. I'm not a Second Amendment. I'm a First Amendment absolutist. I'm not a Second Amendment absolutist. But why don't we go over here? And again, like I said, if anybody wants to get up, please. Your opinion would be honored.
I'm a long-term supporter of the Brady Center, but also a trustee of the Judge David L. Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. Someone I trust told me recently, the Brady Center is as bad as the NRA, and they were referring to the conflation of background checks with people with mental illness. Of course, we know that the data are that mentally ill people are not violent. And so this is a concern to me. What is the Brady Center's stance on mental illness with regard to background checks?
Yeah, we definitely think, and I've spoken a lot about this, that that is not the most important component it's not the driver and should not be the driver in terms of the public discourse in terms of background checks. To be completely honest, the definition of quote-unquote dangerously mentally ill, the American public just kind of takes that at face value, and we could do a lot to kind of trade on that currency, but we don't, because first of all, that definition is a little archaic as it stands now, as people who are institutionalized, have been institutionalized, or ever a couple of other very kind of stringent definitions that don't apply to today's landscape as it relates to mental illness with a lot of outpatient therapy. There's also the issue of stigmatization, that there's only a very, very small number of mental illnesses that are linked to violence. There was a lot of conversation after Newtown around Asperger's, for example. If anything, it actually demonstrates a predisposition towards gentleness. So we are very careful about those dynamics as we have the conversation. And we actually think the mental illness component is much more appropriately dealt with. I think it needs to be part of the conversation around background checks, if we can figure out a way to really identify the warning signs. But I think we can do a lot more good having that conversation around education, letting parents with kids at home, any adolescent, if anybody here is a parent of an adolescent knows that, there are these moments that we all think that they're all mentally have something going on. But educating people about the dangers associated with access to guns, whether it's mentally ill, the predisposition towards suicide, the risk of suicide, and that's a conversation that we think should go on from the perspective of public health and safety campaigns rather than more appropriately than it being the driver of the policy conversation.
Let's try to get in as many other questions as we can. To this gentleman here, and then you could pass it down, actually.
I would like to ask you a question. With the exact stand of the NRA on assault weapons and on these multi-bullet clips, their exact position on those things, people being able to go out and buy assault weapons, carry them legally, and have clips that'll fire 10, 15, 20, 30 bullets.
They're blanketly opposed to any regulation whatsoever.
And by the way, because you know this well, but I'm not sure the audience does. The NRA used to be for gun control.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the interesting
whole story there. It's interesting.
There's a fascinating story about this, but the NRA used to support reasonable gun legislation.
There was a coup at one of their
the history of it is fascinating. Yeah. But within the DNA of the NRA is moderation. So, I mean, it's
And
probably the
your
best
little
sign.
Shout out, I don't want to plug another journalist, but Jill Lepore did that great thing in the New Yorker.
In the magazine that should not be named.
Yeah,
Yes.
about that, giving that whole history.
Yeah,
but
and Adam Winkler, if you want to look at good
yeah.
research, there's a guy at UCLA named Adam Winkler. Anyway, let's come over here, and then I'll come down here.
I work as a director of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in the state of Georgia, and I'm also a citizen lobbyist in the Georgia legislature, and I have to say our state is abysmal on all of these issues. My question is, my group, and I'm with a whole coalition of others in the state of Georgia working on these issues, we all are very concerned about the passive attitude and trying to engage people more in the importance of this. Yep. And we struggle with that. You know, it's almost like all of our friends feel the same way, but they kind of go, oh, you know, good work, glad you're doing it. And then there's also in a state like Georgia also a feeling of we can't get it done. It's just impossible. So how do you overcome that, which is what I want to take back to my group when I go back?
Yeah. That's why we're so focused on reframing this issue as not being about any one tragedy, but being about all of us. And I will point out and simultaneously thank Moms Demand Action for everything that they're doing. You know, the Million Mom March is part of Brady, but you know, I think one of the exciting things happening now is that this issue is transcending being about any one organization. You know, and so just being out there as moms, you know, I would, you know, suggest you put the pressure on yourself every step of the way to demonstrate how this issue is relevant to you from the perspective of what you care about most, which is your kids. That's the power of moms getting involved in this issue. And if we can't do that, we won't succeed. But if we can find these insights, whether it's, you know, I'm a person of faith, so I care about this for the following reason. I'm a mom, so I care about this for the following reason. I live in an impacted community, so I care about it for the following reason. You know, that's the conversation we need to have. At the end of the day, this notion of you know, sympathy, like I was talking about before, it's so important, but it's almost inherently passive. Like when you ask somebody to feel bad about something, okay, where do I take it? We need to demonstrate that people's voice can make a difference, that 30,000 calls into Congress, you know, when we got it, you know, we actually had the reporter from the New York Times in Ayat's office when we were streaming her office with these phone calls, you know, that makes a difference. So you also need to show to your membership the extent to which their voices can make a difference. You know, we have this thing that we're saying now with this Voices Against Violence initiative that we have, you know, My Voice Matters. We need to show people every step of the way why their voice should matter and that their voice does matter. And I think, you know, when we do that, you're going to see a difference in terms of how people get involved in this issue.
Just to add one thing to that, I can't stress the importance because when we meet with our legislators, which we do all the time, they always say they hear 6 to 1 from the other side.
Yep, and we have to change that. And part of that's tactical, and part of that's you know, how we get the message out there. And then just the one other thing I will say is that personal stories are very important, but they can't just be personal stories in a vacuum, and we definitely have to stop giving statistics in a vacuum, especially like these big statistics about how terrible the issue is. At the end of the day, those can almost be disempowering because you can say, what can I as an individual do about it? But if you can take a story of somebody, which happens every day, somebody who was shot by somebody who a background check would have prevented from getting a gun, and present that to your state legislature, as we do on a national level. You know, it's the marriage of, you know, these stories with a demonstration of the impact that this law has had or lack of it has had from a negative perspective and can have from a positive perspective. And I'd be very happy to continue the conversation with you and your folks in Georgia.
Go ahead, right here.
My question is just what Jeff said. I'm a First Amendment absolutist. Quashes the Second Amendment. I don't understand why your organization and the others don't go on the offense and say, hey, my First Amendment rights are being abridged by all these crazies who go out and kill people. And I agree with Jeff. You're not going to win with moderation, and you've got a great argument there. It seems to me you ought to go for it.
Yeah, and I would just point out, I mean, it's kind of the irony of this. I hear more stuff like that than I do kind of the extremist opposition in person. And Jeff and I have had this conversation in some of our spirited phone conversations. I don't think, if you look at this from the perspective of how we can save the most possible lives, I don't think a conversation around changing the Second Amendment is the most constructive conversation to have. I don't think it is from a pragmatic perspective. I don't think it is in terms of...
It didn't work. You had a devastating loss.
No, you know what? So this is the thing with that loss too. Is this loss is different. You know, I watched that Senate vote, the tragedy that took place that day with Sarah Brady, you know, in the gallery there. And right after that vote, she saw it was kind of my first big policy push as president of Brady. And I was upset. I mean, like and she actually felt kind of motherly and wanting to kind of almost console me. And she turned to me and said, you know, sometimes it takes a good defeat. The original Brady law took 7 votes over 6 years, over 3 Congresses to pass. The difference with this loss compared with the others that were tied more to assault weapons ban and not to background checks, is that it really has changed the winds politically. You have the polling that I was talking about. You have the calls that have flooded into the Congress. The American public has become woken up in terms of the extent to which our elected officials are undermining our will and our well-being. So it was a loss. It was devastating, but you know, there's a lot to take inspiration. The majority of the Senate voted in favor of it. 6 A-rated NRA senators. We have made significant progress, and that goes back to the point that I was making before in terms of demonstrating to the American public the extent to which their voice already has made a difference. So I don't look at that loss A, as completely devastating, but B, as any reason to change the approach that is gaining traction.
We're going to do 2 quick more questions. Because of the lights, I can't see back there, so just hand the mic to whoever's raising their hand.
Hi, my name is Carlene Chow, and I live in Spain. And some friends of ours recently, their 11-year-old son sent an email trying to get a rifle. His grandfather's a hunter, so that's why he wanted it. So basically, the Guardia Civil, which is the national police in Spain, showed up at the parent's house because the retailer sent the email to the police, and the police investigated. Now that makes perfect sense to me. And why is it so hard for something like that to happen in the US? Is it just the NRA? I mean, I have trouble believing that in Spain, which has a very recent history of fascism, and has a complete, the national police have relatively very little power there compared to the US, and they don't like big government as well. Why are they so much more effective in handling this than we are here in the US?
Yeah, I mean, the NRA is an agent in this, but it is the extent to which our elected officials are misrepresenting our will and our well-being. And just to point out that anecdote, it's only because of some degree of responsible parenting. Is the parent the one that found that email?
The retailer got the email.
All right, so this kid went to a federally licensed firearm dealer. This kid could have gone on to armslist.com, where right now 73,000 guns, including a whole bunch of AR-15s and assault weapons and everything, are available for sale without any background check whatsoever, and very likely could have actually executed that sale without anybody knowing. You know, it's the equivalent of 2 different lines at an airport with, you know, one with a metal detector and one without it. And, you know, if you're somebody who isn't able to get through the one with the metal detector, you'll choose the one without it.
But can I just interject something here? I mean, we're having another debate in America about the government reading our emails. And seeing what we want. I mean, I'm
want to have that conversation?
No. But I mean, it's a little bit disturbing, the idea that an innocent 11-year-old kid who wants a hunting rifle is going to get visited by the police.
It was the federally licensed firearm dealer, it sounds like, who read the email. The retailer, yeah. So it's the retailer who went to the police.
Okay, and then turned over to the police.
That's what it sounds like, right? The retailer went to the police.
In Spain.
Okay. Got it. So if that happened here, the same thing would have happened if they went to a retailer. Hopefully. I mean, the worst case, the retailer would have just ignored it. Best case is, they may have talked to the authorities, as it might have been their responsibility.
I would say, knowing some gun absolutists, that story would scare the hell out of them, because what they're looking. No, let's be fair. I mean, I'm not agreeing with it. Obviously, I'm not worried about.
He's a prohibited purchaser. Yeah, there are, but they're extremists. I mean, there's no other way to say it. Anybody who's opposed to the idea of somebody running a background check to make sure you're not an 11-year-old kid is an extremist.
I don't think, by the way, that the Snowden issue and the idea that's spreading for good reason that the government is watching us is helping your side necessarily, because the First Amendment absolutists, Second Amendment absolutists, libertarians who are already against you are using this against your movement and talking about.
Yeah, I'll accept the responsibility to show that it's a different conversation.
There was one final question over here, I think, if we can. I see a hand, but I don't see a person. Now I see a person.
Thank you. I have to admit I'm a little concerned about the fact that you've used the word having a conversation 53 times in this meeting. And I'm wondering if that is the best strategic approach to achieving what you want. I have the feeling that the NRA is not sitting there talking about having conversations when they meet in their meeting room.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to be more hard-edged in going after the NRA, specifically going after their source of funding. The source of funding comes from the gun lobby. Is there a way of putting pressure on the gun manufacturers to get at the funding that's the lifeblood of the NRA through going after their boards of directors, which I've seen done very effectively in other situations like this?
Yeah.
You go after the lifeblood of the organization.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of merit to that, and that's that's something that we're always working on. But I don't want to discount this notion of, I'll say it a 54th time, of changing the national conversation that we're having around guns. Because the reason the gun lobby isn't talking about changing the conversation is because they don't need to. They own it. And we need to make this a conversation that's coming from the American public. And I will stand by very strongly and be happy to demonstrate the extent to which, if we can engage the American public in this issue in a deep and meaningful way, that not only is our best chance of creating fundamental change and holding our elected officials accountable, it's our only chance. So I don't accept I guess, criticism of talking about this in terms of a conversation, but I do appreciate the importance of, at the end of the day, if you can find a way to take these guys to task, make it hurt financially, then that's an important part of the strategy. Another big part of that is with the insurance industry. We should be talking about, and there should be, and insurance companies should be acting around access to a gun in the home the way we talk about other public health and safety risks, like tobacco, like smoking. You have to pay more on your life insurance if you're a smoker. You get asked that question. There's a tangible liability that you introduce into your home when you bring a gun into your home. Every gun owner will acknowledge that. Every gun owner is willing to acknowledge it, and there's no reason everybody in our society should bear that burden of that choice / right of gun owners. So I do think the financial conversation and pursuing that actively is very important as well.
One of the things I enjoy most about my job is talking to Dan, and I'm glad that we could share you today. And thank you very much.
Fun
thank
as always,
you very much for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Be careful.